right, so if anyone here thinks that you can't fit an eternal punishment into a finite amount of time, wait to hear this presentation.
I see what he did there.
So before I get into it, a little housekeeping. So first, some notes on terminology. So in popular parlance, a word like angel is a catch-all that refers to any good spiritual being, except for God, and demon refers to any bad spiritual being. That's kind of the way we use the words. And scholars have kind of debated the accuracy of that nomenclature, but I'm going to use it just because it's handy for the sake of convenience. So other terms that are going to come up for angels: sons of God, B'nai Elohim is one of them. Sons of the Most High also comes up, B'nai Elyon, gods, Elohim, which if you know a little bit about Hebrew, you also know that's the word for God, but it's a plural form and sometimes refers to gods or angels as well. And I didn't translate this because there's different words that are used, but stars and host of heaven are also words that get used to refer to these sort of angelic beings. And they're all going to be relevant for what we're going to talk about here.
So that's a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before a fallen angel fell, they would be in heaven and we call it Elohim.
So,
and then I guess I follow that up with being sent to earth after the fall. Would that fallen angel be considered a territorial evil spirit in the sense of Heiser?
That's a good question. Yeah, some of that stuff is a little bit complicated and might take us veers a little bit off course for this conversation, because I mean even the language of fallen angel is somewat traditional in Christian thinking, but is arguably not reflected exactly as what the text describes. But it's funny you mentioned Heiser, because I'm gonna that's part of my housekeeping that I want to kind of start with here.
Were you mentioning of Heiser?
Yes. So one of the arguments, or one of the passages that I think is going to be really relevant here, is rooted in what is called divine counsel theology. Is everybody familiar with that more or less?
I'm new to it, but
okay. So I'll go over it just to kind of make sure that the background's familiar, but what they call the Deuteronomy 32 worldview as well. So I'll spend a little time in Deuteronomy 32 before I move forward. That's not the entirety of my argument, but it is part of the argument I'm going to make. Just for those who maybe are watching online who aren't as familiar, one place where we see this divine counsel idea come up is in 1 Kings 22. And the basic idea is that God is delegating authority to and consults with this council of angels, right? And so we see it here. The prophet Micaiah is speaking to Ahab. Ahab has consulted all his false prophets to verify that this battle is going to be successful. And Micaiah comes forward, the prophet who always prophesies bad things for him, whom he hates, but he tells the truth. And Micaiah says, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, Yahweh said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. So other than the whole question of apologetics and whether God could send somebody to tell a lie, what we do have here is this idea, or kind of a reference that's, I think, this kind of peek behind the curtain to see how this divine counsel thing might work. So that's one of the kind of more uncontested passages. Divine counsel theology was once more strongly associated with liberal theologians who claimed that it undermined conservative claims of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible. But believing scholars like Michael Heiser, like Ben Witherington, like Tim Mackey from the Bible Project, which is a pretty successful online series, they've shown that in no way, that this divine counsel theory in no way undermines God's uniqueness, since he's still the uncreated creator and judge of the other members of the divine council. And those who are interested in more resources about divine counsel theology, any other topics I'll discuss today, or just me, there's a link at the bottom here, cantus-hermes.com/rh22, that will have other resources that you guys can check out. All right, housekeeping is done, so now we can get into it. Okay, so here's the problem that I'm trying to address here. There are many Christians who are open to the idea of conditional immortality for humans, but still doubt that it applies to spiritual beings like demons and Satan. That's a position that I've heard a lot. So in other words, they can imagine lost human beings being destroyed, but it seems more likely to them that Satan and the demons might still suffer eternal conscious torment. And as I've listened to these arguments, I've noticed a few reasons consistently given for their skepticism about the conditional immortality of angels. And here's the ones I've noticed the most. Oh wait, I went too far? What did I do here?
Yeah.
I did, there it was. Revelation 20:10 suggests ongoing torment for Satan. So this is the most kind of root biblical argument. The devil who deceived them was thrown in the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. On the surface, that's a pretty strong Satan is going to burn forever kind of argument, or verse. 2 is that spiritual beings don't have bodies which are prone to decay, so it's easier to imagine them being immortal like God. This seems even more likely because angels and demons are described as still existing over long periods of time. So, for instance, Satan is this character who lives and acts throughout the scriptures, both Old and New Testaments. So it's kind of easier to imagine that maybe they live forever because you never hear about them dying, right? And also 3, Satan is so exceptionally bad that destruction seems like an insufficient punishment for him. So we say maybe, my neighbor Joe, the atheist or something, maybe he just gets destroyed, but not Satan. I mean, these are the worst areas, right? The problem with 3 is that it's based on what our own sense of justice requires and not God's. So the problem with 2 is that it's more like a hunch than a biblically based argument. The average mortality doesn't really posit how long a person is going to live, human, angelic, or otherwise. It's really a claim about why we live at all. And the answer to that is that we exist because God desires it. And since this is so, we will live as long as he wills it. And so I think 2 and 3 are not very helpful, but 1 I think still has some persuasion here. When it comes to reasons 2 and 3, the real question which we must answer is whether God wills for spiritual beings in rebellion to live forever or not. And we might answer questions like that through philosophical speculation about God's purposes. We might say that fallen spiritual beings are going to live forever because God thinks that they deserve eternal conscious torment, or because he's glorified by their ongoing punishment. But if you take a conditionalist viewpoint, you might say that God doesn't want the demons to live forever because he desires to remove all evil from his good creation. But I think we can do better than philosophical speculation. I want to look a little bit more closely at the biblical data that tells us about the fate of demons. Any questions or pushback so far? Are we doing okay? Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So, moving forward into the scripture. So if you're like me, you spent years reading your Old Testament and missing one of the most significant passages about angelic beings in the entire Bible. Here's how it reads in the NIV. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Did you catch it? Did you catch the super important reference to angels?
Yeah, it's because it's in the NIV.
It's in the NIV, right? So let's look at it in another translation. ESV. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So which is it? Sons of Israel, sons of God. We know sons of God is a title for a class of angelic beings, at least from Job, because it comes up there a few times, but other places as well. But sons of Israel obviously just refers to Israelites. So why is there a discrepancy here? And the answer to that is that the NIV and a lot of other translations are using the medieval Masoretic Hebrew text as its underlying text or translation. And that text reads, sons of Israel. But the ESV is relying on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were roughly contemporaneous with Jesus, and that's where it gets the reading, sons of God. So according to the sons of God reading, there was a moment in time when God split up humanity into distinct nations, with the exception of Israel, which he chooses for himself. And he gives these nations over to these angelic beings called the sons of God to superintend. Does anybody have any guesses as to when that might have happened in the biblical timeline? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Tower Babylon.
Babylon, you got it. Yep. So after humanity unites to build a tower that reaches to the heavens to make a name for themselves, God punishes them by confusing their languages, with the result that they're divided into 70 distinct nations, at least according to the table of nations in Genesis 10. And the 70 number then becomes really important in Jewish and Christian thought as this number which represents the nations, right? So let's say we go with the Masoretic text, though, and we go with that reading that God divides the nations up according to the number of the sons of Israel. What would that number be? Because it's not really obvious just from that verse. I mean, you might say, is it the millions of over 1 million Israelites that left Egypt, according to the Exodus story?
Or could be 12.
12 sons of Jacob? Well, there's actually a passage that, I don't think I have it on here, do I? No, I don't. There's actually a passage that could be what the number that's in mind here. Exodus 1:5, it's the number of the Israelites who went into, the number of the sons of Jacob who went into Egypt. So the sons, the grandsons, and so on and so forth. That number is 70. So just like the Table of Nations, 70. So it's possible that what the Masoretic text is doing here has a sort of oblique reference to that 70 number and is sort of pointing back to something else.
Well, it seems to me like the number 70 is more likely just a reference to all.
Mm-hmm. It could be as far as in the Table of Nations.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, so like, is like, I guess I feel like no need to be literalistic about it.
Yeah, that could be.
It's like,
70,
it's only-
70 times 7 just means complete, right?
Yeah, I can see that too.
Yeah, it could be, well, yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna be dogmatic one way or another, but it does seem like, especially in the context, very plausible. The idea is like, whoa, okay, is that because there's only 70 nations?
Yeah,
And it's like, or is it a reference to the completion of all nations?
all the nations, yeah. But I think the point that's sort of interesting is that number comes up as well when the number of the Israelites is given, is the number of sons of Jacob. So I think there might be a connection there. And, okay, let me see here. So the next verse, Deuteronomy 32:9, which I didn't quote, tells us that the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is his allotted heritage. So God gets Israel, who gets the nations? The Masoretic text doesn't really tell us, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls do. So does the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, which is also roughly contemporaneous with Jesus. It doesn't say sons of Israel, and it doesn't say sons of God. It gives us a third option. Anybody know what it is? What's up there?
Angels of God?
Yep, you got it. Angels of God. The Most High divided the nations. He separated the sons of Adam. He set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. Sons of God, sons of Israel, angels of God. So we've got 3 readings now. So it seems to me that what the Septuagint here is doing is probably softening the sons of God language, because it sounds like maybe that's not as monotheistic as we'd like it to sound. And so they soften it to angels of God. That seems at least the most plausible explanation to me. And then I think the Masoretic text comes later, and it goes with sons of Israel, because it also feels really weird about this text, but still doesn't want to completely remove the reference. So it goes with this number of the sons of Israel, which points to 70, which points to what happens at the Tower of Babel. At least that seems to be the most plausible explanation. There's also a loose Aramaic translation of Deuteronomy 32. Are you guys familiar with the Targums? These are these Aramaic translations that are very paraphrastic. They add a lot of information. And it's Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. It's probably also from the Middle Ages. But it actually seems to be aware of at least 2 of these readings and combines them in an interesting way. It says, when the Most High made allotment of the world unto the nations which proceeded from the sons of Noah, and the separation of the writings and languages of the children of men at the time of the division, so specific reference to Babel there, he cast the lot among the 70 angels, the princes of the nations with whom is the revelation to oversee the city. Even at that time, he established the limits of the nations according to the sum of the number of the 70 souls of Israel who went down into Egypt. So it's got both. Yeah. And so we also know, I'm going to mention this too, that Jewish and Christian documents from before the medieval period understood this text, the Deuteronomy text, to be clearly speaking of angelic beings placed over nations. So we've got, for example, Jubilees, which is an intertestamental work that was very influential in Jewish thought and Christian thought too. He chose Israel to be his people. He sanctified it and gathered it from amongst the children of men. For there are many nations and many peoples, and all are his, and over all hath he placed spirits in authority to lead them astray from him. So that's the explanation for why God gives the nations to the angels here, is that he actually wants them to lead them astray. Paul seems to reflect a different understanding in the Mars Hill sermon, where he talks about God sort of dividing up the nations and putting people where they're going to be so that they might reach out for him and grasp for him and find him, right? So Paul has a very different reading than the Doctrine of Jubilees, but that's an aside. But over Israel, he did not appoint any angel or spirit, for he alone is their ruler. I'll give you one more. Sirach, also an important Jewish document. It's included in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox canons, but not the Protestant. And it paraphrases our passage this way. For in the division of the nations of the whole earth, he set a ruler over every people, but Israel is the Lord's portion. And that part in italics is missing in some manuscripts, but the message is still the same. It just kind of helps solidify what is being referred to. As I mentioned, this understanding is also a Christian one. You can find it in a lot of church fathers, including in Jerome. And I mentioned Jerome just because I love the way he does it. So he's, in his commentary on Daniel 10, which is another passage about the prince of Persia who's over, like this angel who's over Persia, who's fighting with the prince of Greece, who's this other angel. So this sort of behind the scenes spirits fighting over the nations, So when he's explaining it, he just says, this is in accordance with what we read in Deuteronomy. That's it. Just a quick throwaway reference. For him, he knows that his audience is going to know what he's talking about, right? So all of this fascinating background, which doesn't have anything to do with annihilation so far, I know, is going to help us to understand another passage which speaks directly to judgment against rebellious angels. Is anybody having trouble with the concept so far?
No, I just wanted to clarify the last part. You said,
Yeah.
is that mentioned in Daniel? Daniel, that this is in accordance with Deuteronomy?
That's what Jerome says in his
Oh, that's
commentary.
okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep. All right. So Psalm 82. Psalm 82 peels back the curtain and gives us a look into God's divine counsel among these angelic beings who are given charge over the nations. It reads, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver from the hand of the wicked. So obviously they're doing a bad job. God is irritated with them for how poorly they're managing the nations. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, and this is God speaking, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. So let's note the relevant features here. The scene is a divine council scene. God judges in the midst of the Elohim, of the gods. In other divine council settings, the location is a heavenly one, and the participants are not human. So some have tried to argue that maybe, I think Wesley and Spurgeon, I think when I consulted them, they both take the view that we have human judges in Israel in mind. But that doesn't seem to be the case when we read about these divine council scenes in other places. It's actually pretty obviously not. God is charging the gods with gross mismanagement of the nations which they've been given. And the fact that it's not Israel in view, but the nations, I think is apparent because the psalmist looks forward to the day when God will take back the nations, which he gave up, and make sure justice is done. So this bit at the end here, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. The nations come into view, it's not just Israel in focus. 3, the gods do not expect to die like men, but they will. This raises 2 very significant questions. What does it mean for men to die? And what would it mean for angels to die in like fashion? Oh, I ruined
I know.
Spoiler. You got it, yeah. So one traditional answer is that when a human being dies, their body dies, but their spirit lives on forever. That can't be the case with angels. Angels are spirit beings. They're spirits by nature, right? So God can't be warning them that their bodies will fall apart even as their souls go on living. Doesn't really make sense. So the other option that I can think of, before I give my solution, is that can anybody think of another possibility here? What would it mean for men to die, and what would it mean for angels to die like men?
Well, I mean, the traditional answer is still separation from God.
They're good. Yeah, so it could be a spiritual separation.
Yeah, that's what it means. In lots of the traditional views, that's what it means to die.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I didn't include that in my slides. That would be definitely one traditional answer you could give.
And
Yeah,
die could also mean die.
yeah, it could also mean die.
Well,
right?
but I mean, that's the word in question.
Right.
You can't reference, you can't self-reference.
Good. Yeah, I wish I would have put that in there. That's a good point.
It's all right, next time.
Yeah. So what I would say is that this must be death as it appears to human observers, right? So when we think of someone or something as dying, we see that their personality ceases, their knowledge, their experience seems to go away. Now, do they have a spirit or something that lives on? Possibly, but that's not what we experience, that's not what we observe, right? The author of Ecclesiastes, another Hebrew writer, uses that, quote, the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. So I think that that's kind of what what we have in mind here. Something about how we experience human death, how we think of human death is what's going to happen to the angels. And, when someone that you go to a funeral and someone you love is dead and you put them in the ground, you don't think of them as being conscious anymore, existing anymore. They're dead.
Okay, so I have a question since I'm here at this conference.
Yeah.
Do you guys reject NDEs, near-death experiences? Or is there a particular view on this?
So I can't speak for the whole organization, but I happen to, I think, know what their position
Just
is.
a
Yeah.
general idea.
Yeah, as far as the intermediate state is concerned, Rethinking Hell doesn't have a position. So there are some who believe that you have a soul and then it continues on, and so you could have an NDE because you have a soul that exists. But not all annihilationists believe that. Some annihilationists are also physicalists.
Sure.
Yeah. So physicalists, I guess, would probably reject an NDE because it doesn't really make sense to have a spirit floating over a body and seeing things.
Yeah.
I'm kind of agnostic on the question, but I lean toward the existence of the soul. I think it makes sense of certain biblical passages. Yeah.
And the NDE could also be like an experience with the intermediate state too, if that exists, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, some people talk about maybe seeing heaven or hell or
Yeah.
something like that, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's my one main verse that I think is pretty important here that helps clarify some of this. There's another word though, or another how do I say this? Collection of words that are used in the Bible to identify angels, and that's the star host of heaven language. So we have, for example, Job 38:7, which identifies the sons of God who shouted for joy as they watched God create the earth. It refers to them as morning stars. Isaiah 14:13, Satan, the morning star, schemes to usurp God's position in the divine council, which it parallels with ascending above the stars of God. So ascending above the stars of God, I think when I used to read that passage, I would sort of imagine, you're just very high, right? High up above the stars. But the stars language, I think, is meant to invoke the angels. So this is a being who wants to be at the head of the divine council, wants to be above all the other angels, and wants to even basically take God's position, right? Isaiah 14, I didn't know already, sorry. We also have, actually before I mention that one, First Enoch 90 is kind of an interesting one. So this is an intertestamental work, pseudepigraphal work, there's a passage in, I think it's chapters 89 and 90, which are called the animal apocalypse, which it basically tells the whole history of Israel with animals representing the persons, the different characters, but the angels are stars in that passage. And what do we got here? Stars represent angels in Revelation 1:20 as well. In the Hebrew Bible, host of heaven can refer to stars. It can refer to angels or gods or both. Although I'm going to be honest with you, I tried to separate all these out. I would say in pretty much all of the passages that I could find where that host of heaven language shows up, it's ambiguous. It could be stars, it could be angels, it could be both. I would actually probably put all of them in the both category, but some of them seem more like they're about stars and some more like about angels. A lot of times you'll have references to people worshiping the host of heaven, and then so that identifies them as sun, moon, and stars, but it also refers to this sort of idolatry and the worship of other gods. So it's really kind of hazy to separate that out. Okay, so their fate. So we've established this stars, host of heaven language refers to angels. So let's look at how that language gets used. And also keep in mind what I said about the gods as the guardians of the nations, right? So let's look at a passage like Isaiah 24:21. On that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven in the heaven and the kings of earth on the earth. So there's this kind of interesting parallel here. So we talked about how these angels are sort of like monarchs over these nations, and it puts them in parallel with the actual monarchs of the nations. The kings and the angels are both going to be punished. It doesn't exactly say that their punishment is the same punishment, but it is kind of interesting that they're placed in parallel. That's at least suggested, right? They seem to be tied together. Also, when Isaiah returns to the discussion of the punishment of the host of heaven in chapter 34, he tells us that they will rot away, fall as leaves fall from the vine, right? This punishment is placed also in parallel with what God will do to the host of the nations. And actually that phrase is used, the host of the nations. So there's an interesting parallel, host of heaven and host of the nations. And the host of the nations, he says, he has devoted them to destruction, has given them over to slaughter. Sorry, I hate having pauses. So I think here what you have is this sort of parallel fate, this parallel punishment between the angels and the nations that they represent. Maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room in there to say that maybe there's somewhat different punishments. But I think rotting away, falling as leaves fall from the vine, those evoke this kind of death imagery, I think, pretty strongly. Then we have, so just focusing in a little bit more on Satan. Actually, before we turn to Revelation, I want to spend a little time in the Old Testament, what it seems to say about Satan. There are some scholars who do identify the identification of Satan with the kingly figures in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, which I'm going to be getting into. But there is both textual evidence and tradition in its favor, although I don't have time to get into that, so you're going to have to take my word for it. So Isaiah 14. A judgment is issued against the king of Babylon, and it compares this evil leader to another figure, a star who sought to ascend to heaven above the other stars of God and establish his throne in place of God's. The consequence of the judgment against this person, this star, is that he'll be brought down to Sheol, but as an object of shame, he will not be buried. So this death language is pretty strong there. Now, it's admittedly difficult to separate what applies to the king of Babylon, what applies to Satan, what applies to both, because Isaiah seems to kind of start with the king of Babylon, move on to Satan, and then at the end, is he talking about Satan? Is he talking about the king of Babylon? There's a parallel that's happening. He's really kind of connecting them together, right? So it seems quite reasonable to me to suppose that the judgment applies in some ways to both. But it is interesting that sort of death and being, dying without being buried language is applied to Satan. Something very similar can be said for, wait on, is anything else? Oh, maybe I saw another point here. King of Babylon, no, I already said that, didn't I? Yeah, I said that. Satan, Ezekiel 28. Something similar can be said about the prince of Tyre in Ezekiel 28. This prince fancies himself a god, but God warns him that he's a mere man and will die like one. They say that he is like the cherub in Eden. He's this angelic being. Or actually, I guess you could say that it shifts a little bit. So language doesn't say you are like the cherub. It says you were the anointed cherub. But there's a parallel that's happening. There's a comparison that's being made. So he's like the cherub in Eden who becomes unrighteous and is cast out. And the punishment that he's going to have is, quote, I brought fire out from your midst, it consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. All who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You've come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever. And that fire language is very evocative of this kind of final punishment, like a fire imagery that we're going to see in the rest of Scripture, right? Any questions so far? Or pushback? I'm fine with pushback too. Well, that catches us up, I think, on the Old Testament.
Well, actually, one question.
Yeah.
Because, so the last part here, right? You're talking about all who know you, among peoples who call you, or whatever.
Yeah.
I guess is it just like in this context or whatever, it's just a future prophetic word? Would be the notion?
I think so, yeah. Even though the sometimes the past tense will be used to refer to something in the future that is certain. So I would say yes. Yeah. Although I'm trying to think of the timeline here. I mean, is it possible that the Prince of Tyre has already been destroyed? It seems unlikely because this is a judgment issued against him. But I'd have to look at the timeline on that.
Because I don't know, it just seems funny. It's like, all right, you've come to a dreadful end.
Yeah.
You shall be no more.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say at the very least in reference to Satan, but maybe also the Prince of Tyre, because I don't know the timeline. It's probably a past tense that has a future force.
I think so, because I think at the start of that passage, like verse 12 or so, it's saying, go and say this to the Prince of Tyre.
There you go. Yeah, I think you're right. All right, so I think that catches us up on the Old Testament, and we can turn to the book of Revelation and see what it has to say about the eternal fate of Satan. So here's our tough passage. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. I skipped a little bit, but you might have noticed that I'm trying to draw the connections. So here are the relevant features of this text. 1, the devil is thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, following the beast and the false prophet. 2, the punishment is said to be torment day and night forever and ever. 3, death and Hades are also thrown into the lake of fire. And 4, the lake of fire is identified with the second death. So point 1, I don't think is going to be very controversial. Conditionalists and traditionalists can both affirm that the text says that and doesn't really create any problems for our positions. Point 2, I think suggests eternal conscious torment for the devil, so that needs to be satisfactorily answered by the conditionalists.
I'm sorry, I have a question on number 1.
Yeah.
Physical sulfur, like really sulfur like you find in the lab, or like?
That's a great question.
Yeah. And physically thrown?
Yeah. That would be a question above my pay grade.
Okay.
But yeah,
Fair
but certainly Revelation is apocalyptic,
Yeah.
so sometimes you can run into trouble literalizing it too much.
Yeah.
But obviously it means something. There's something that it refers to, that this language can be said to be truthful.
And how, I mean, just because how you answer that's going to determine, the rest of it. Is it physically tormented, if it's not physical sulfur, is it physical torment, all the.
Well, so
Yeah,
I like where you're going,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to go there quite the same way you're getting there, but
Okay.
I'm going to get there another way.
gotcha. Keep
Okay.
going.
So points 3 and 4 suggest conditionalism. And here's why. For one, it would seem to follow from from 3 and 4, sorry, let's see, follow from these 2 points, from the 3 and 4, that the lake of fire destroys what's thrown into it, right? Death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. What happens to death and Hades?
I'm sorry, but how can death be thrown?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah.
Symbolically.
Yeah, symbolically thrown. But what would it mean?
Yeah, but what is it? It's not a physical thing. I can't just pick up death and throw it. It's an event that happens to you.
It's not.
It's a state.
There is a traditionalist who's got a commentary on Revelation. Is it Beale? I want to say it's Beale. Beale argues that death and Hades are actually angelic beings, and so that you can have them literally thrown into the fire. I don't.
Is there any support for that?
No,
Okay.
no. I think he's trying to hold on to traditionalism, and he sees
Sure.
that there's a problem.
Fair enough.
I'm not trying to disparage Beale because I think Beale's a great scholar, but that'd be my inclination to think. But what would that mean? So if death and Hades are not these literal things, but they're these sort of abstract concepts, what does it mean that they're thrown into the fire?
Yeah, it's just talking about them being destroyed or being eliminated.
You got it. So then that tells us, at least 3 at the very least, that the lake of fire destroys. At least destroys something. It destroys death and Hades, right?
Yeah.
So that's 1. And I think if the lake of fire destroys death and Hades, that would maybe at least imply that it would also destroy the other things that are thrown into it, including Satan, right? Despite that language that we talked about in point 2, right? That's not all, though. I would also point to the second death language. First of all, second death, I think, does suggest death and not eternal torment. But also, Chris Date and William Tanksley have a pretty good presentation they did on this. I want to say, was it for a regional ETS, maybe?
I think so.
I think so, too. And they actually point to some really, and I've got a link to that on my page if you want to look at that. And one of the most intriguing outside uses, outside of the Bible, that they point to for second death, appears in a Targum, which is, I guess, technically the Bible, but it's this sort of loose translation. And it's a Targum of Jeremiah 51:39. The Hebrew reads, "They will sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake, declares the Lord." The Targum reads, "They shall die the second death and shall not live for the world to come." So we have some outside references where second death does seem to have this suggestion of cessation of existence, right? And thirdly, and this point can be debated, it seems likely to me that the beast and the false prophet are also not individuals or persons, but they're powers and systems. They're abstract as well. So what does it mean for an abstract system to be thrown into the lake of fire? What would it mean for France or America or Russia to be thrown into the lake of fire? Are we imagining that every person who's a part of that, country is thrown into the lake of fire?
Democracy, for instance.
Yeah.
Could be thrown into the lake of fire because there's no more democracy.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I've been seeing a lot of stuff, election material. If you don't vote this way, democracy is done for. At the end of democracy.
Second.
Yeah, we're not imagining some guy named Democracy getting stabbed. That's not what they mean by that, right? So basically what we've got here is we have death, Hades, the beast, the false prophet. We have four things that are probably not persons, that probably can't suffer eternal conscious torment. And they're thrown in the lake of fire. So we've got one, Satan, the fifth, that seems to have personal identity. So it's curious, we'll say, right? So, and actually, if you look at Daniel 7:11, which is definitely a source for what's going on in Revelation here, you have this beast, right? So you have the four different beasts that are different successive empires, and you get to the last one, and it's slain, killed, thrown into the fire to be burned up. So first it's killed, then it's thrown in the fire, and then the Son of Man comes and establishes the kingdom. And so if that's the parallel, that's what's being referred to, I'm going to assume that maybe what John is thinking is kind of what Daniel's saying, right? Or else he wouldn't quote it. So in other words, I would say that the beast, at least in Daniel, is annihilated. And if John is quoting Daniel, then I would say probably the beast that John is talking about is also annihilated. You okay so far? Okay. So all this leaves us with one thorny problem. The Old Testament tells us that the devil and his demons will be destroyed. Revelation also seems to suggest it, except in that one place where it says that Satan will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So how do we resolve that difficulty? And actually, I've already kind of said this, but I'll say it again. Is Satan the exception? In Revelation 20, four abstract concepts, death, Hades, the beast, and the false prophet, are thrown into the lake of fire, and they're destroyed by it. That's, I think, the clear message, despite the confusing language of torment forever and ever. Should we think of the fifth object, Satan, as the one exception where something thrown in the lake of fire is not destroyed by it? If there was no other biblical, sorry, I don't have my notes in here about where the little partial clicks are. If there's no other biblical data about the fate of Satan, I'd say this was a possibility. But the rest of Scripture is univocal on this subject. This univocality, along with the fact that the forever torment language also actually communicates death in regard to 4 of the 5 things at the very least, and not torment. And these are things that are, so actually the beast and the false prophet are said to be tormented forever and ever alongside Satan. So their identity, or their fate is shared, right? So it's pretty interesting. So all that to me suggests, it will lead me to conclude that torment is also apocalyptic language, which points to destruction in the case of Satan as well. So in sum, the fate of Satan and the demons will be the same as those humans who rejected God, which is utter destruction. And
So you're saying forever and ever is apocalyptic language?
it's apocalyptic language. I don't know if hyperbole is the right word.
Well, no, it's meant to be a finality. So like, in other words, when you're talking about it or whatever, you don't think about it like it's eternal in the sense that it keeps going. It's eternal in the sense that it's final.
Yeah. In its effect, yeah.
Yeah. It's a final pronouncement. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And I think, these passages in Revelation, I think, are probably the strongest passages for the eternal conscious torment view, which is a problem for their position. Because if they're getting their eschatology from apocalyptic literature, it's, you probably want to ground it on something a little more concrete, right? Not something quite so figurative. But anyway, that's basically my presentation. As I mentioned, there's that link there which has some more resources that you might find useful if you're curious about what we're talking about here, including that presentation that Chris Date and William Tanksley did that I thought was really good. And also, I've got a book on the resurrection that's related to this topic that's actually free on Kindle right now, and there's a link to that as well. Okay, any feedback, any questions? How much time do we actually have at this point? Sorry.
1:43 right now.
Okay, so we're good on time. Okay. Any follow-up, any issues?
I'm trying to find the person. Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned a book called Resurrection.
Oh yeah, I've got a book called The Gospel of the Resurrection, where I'm arguing that annihilation is the bad news that makes the good news make sense. And so, particularly in relation to the way that the apostles preach the gospel message. They never preach this eternal conscious torment message, but they do talk about death and resurrection.
So say the name of it again?
The gospel of the resurrection, but if you follow that link, there's a link to it there as well. It's a short book. Chris was nice enough to write the foreword for it. All right, anything else?
I can't think of it off the top of my head. There's a verse in Hebrews that says God's going to destroy him who has the power of death. So it seems consistent with what you're saying.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about quoting that. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Is what I'm presenting here seem sort of persuasive? Are there issues with it? Do you see flaws or problems?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say, like, I mean, because talking about the subject specifically,
Yeah.
or whatever, I guess I don't particularly find there to be any significant difference between Satan and other non-believers. So
Yeah.
to me, it all just goes back to the original
Yeah.
subject, you know, and that idea, right?
I agree. Yeah.
If annihilationism works or whatever, yeah. I mean, I was going to be interested if you were going to present something other than the idea that. Satan faced some sort of different or distinction, especially in Revelation or whatever. It seems like the fate of both are tied together. So
I agree with that. Yeah, I think though because Satan is the only person who's described as suffering forever and ever.
well, and to actually give you some even more ammo potentially and stuff, I was listening to somebody else and they actually proposed the idea that even the title is actually more of a reference to an office rather than an individual.
Yeah, the adversary.
Yeah, and so even in that sense, or whatever, even when it's listing Satan or whatever, that it's again talking about a non-corporeal specific entity rather than it's talking about again an office. This idea that the office might be occupied by different malevolent, unclean spirits or whatever, but yeah.
I think that argument is probably the strongest when it comes to the Old Testament, where you have who is it that rises up against Israel and has David number the people?
Yeah, Zechariah. Or no, you're talking about that part.
And
but then you have Zechariah where you have the accuser and the defendant for Joshua the high priest.
Sure, and you can see where maybe that might not be the Satan. But I think when you get to the New Testament, I think the Satan terminology seems to be kind of fixed on one person, and it's identified with specifically that serpent from Eden, especially in Revelation, right, where the dragon is that old serpent.
And Satan, who tempted Jesus in the wilderness.
Right. But now hypothetically, I do hold to it more so being a person. Mm-hmm. Hypothetically, I would say that it's perfectly consistent with it being an office, because again, even referencing the serpent from Genesis or whatever would still be referencing the office in every occasion. So saying, oh yeah, this office, this is the person that, whoever was in the particular office at the time is irrelevant.
Yeah.
Since it's still the same office doing the activities and all occasions.
I have to think a little about that, but that could be, that's interesting. It's an interesting thought. Yeah.
I keep wrapping my mind around the physical versus non-physical, controversy. And if Satan's not physical, he can't be physically thrown into a physical lake of fire and experience physical suffering. So
but I think he is physical.
In his own self, he is physical. I mean,
I think all the angels are. Now that's another whole other subject and stuff. But because I think that's actually more so implied in Daniel. Okay. And I think all of the angels exist and move in time.
That's a big question. There's a sense in which Scripture talks about them as spirits and not being physical, but then they sometimes do things that seem physical, right? Especially if you hold to the Genesis 6.
But they all seem to be essentially located in one location at different times, right?
Yeah.
So we can talk about the distinctions. What does it mean to be spiritual or non-spiritual or physical and all these things? Yeah. But one, it seems obvious that all angels are essentially located in some space.
Which is what we think of as physicality, is to be located.
Yeah. And they move, they talk. Mm-hmm. They seem to be restricted by the same timeline that we are.
Do you believe in the human souls?
Yes, I would be a dualist in this regard.
Well, I guess my question is your soul located in one place then?
I would actually be more inclined to say yes. Okay. And it is a particularly strange thing or whatever, but over the course of time or whatever, I would lean towards that.
Yeah, which would suggest to me that maybe non-physical things could still be centralized, right? I mean, like,
That's right.
Because I mean, I don't know what you can say about God, but I wouldn't think of God as physical, but his presence can be centralized in like the temple, right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, but it's interesting to think about. I have my own questions about how to sort those questions out, because there does seem to be sort of a locality and movement aspect that happens to spiritual beings.
Yeah.
There's also questions there with like physicality versus like tangibility or something, because we know there's physical realities, physical things like the air that you can't grab the air. You know what I mean? Like it's still technically physical.
Yeah.
Like it could be a sort of thing where, like, we acknowledge these spirits don't have flesh, for example, but they, at least I think we kind of just take for granted some of the time that they are fundamentally different and not in some way made of physical material. Because like if a spirit, like the word pneumum, can also mean breath. Like if they're made of something like air, that can sort of be, made tangible. I could see something like that coming across as well.
Yeah. I want to say, maybe I'm wrong, I want to say that C.S. Lewis once suggested that it was, maybe not physical in the sense that we think about it. But getting back to the main question, even if we think of Satan as not being physical, of being this kind of spiritual entity that can't suffer eternal conscious torment in flames, well, you could say something sort of similar about the beast, the false prophet, death, and Hades.
Yeah, because I used to take those physical too, like the false prophet was a person. Maybe I just don't understand Revelation well enough to know for sure, but I always kind of lean toward the false prophet as a person. But then if he's being thrown in the same place that these non-physical beings that he's thrown into, then maybe he's not physical, or he's something other than a person.
Well, the one thing I would say is I think Satan is a spiritual person, whereas those other four things are abstract entities.
Okay.
Right? So there's a difference between Satan and them. But the one thing that might be in common is they're not physical, so they can't experience pain the way that
so
we
you're
do.
throwing the person into the same place that you're throwing these non-physical.
Yeah. But I think the ultimate question is, is the lake of fire doing something different to Satan than it's doing to everything else?
Yeah.
And I don't see how that really makes a lot of sense.
No, I'll ask a question actually that I asked Chris Date, and that is that conditional immortality or whatever, under the guise of conditional immortality, if that's to be true, then in a sense nobody's really punished, right? At the end, death is not really the punishment; it's merely the natural way of things. If conditional mortality is the natural state.
Well, I think it depends on get a little bit of systematic theology here, maybe, but are we punished for Adam's sin? Are we punished for our own sin? Because you could say that if we're punished for Adam's sin, then that death comes to all men because of Adam. So then sin becomes a punishment for all of humankind. And the release of that punishment is salvation through Jesus Christ, right? One thing I think that Chris and I disagree on is that I don't think that Chris affirms degrees of punishment beyond death, whereas it seems to me that Jesus refers to that, right? So, especially some of the parables about the disobedient servants, there are degrees of punishment. One servant is punished more, another servant is punished less. And I think that's a problem for both an annihilationist view that it's death and that's it, that's the only punishment. I think it's also a problem for eternal conscious torment, especially as it's described as, by a lot of its proponents, that when you offend an infinite God or this infinitely good God, you deserve some kind of an infinite punishment. Well, infinity doesn't really admit of degrees as far as I can tell.
Okay, but that is inaccurate. There are larger and smaller infinities. Anyway, so there are larger and smaller infinities and stuff like that. And of course, you can talk about that stuff, but well, let's not worry about the philosophical. But I would say, like, let's look at because I know what you're saying, because you're just like, well, look, on eternal conscious torment, it's an infinite punishment. Therefore, in essence, it's univocal across all of those that are punished. And of course, in annihilationism or whatever, you're just like, well, if death is the actual punishment, which was part of my question the other day, and so that's one of the probably the areas also that I'll just say that to be blunt, I feel like is a little bit weak maybe, and I'm much more open to the idea. Let's say you have this view of some sort of long-standing temporal punishment. So like, what? We'll just, for the sake of simple argument, right? Okay, like sort of bad, like, 1,000 years of punishment, so super bad, 5,000 years, and then, ultimate death is ultimately still the end for all. But that makes some sort of distinction between.
Yeah, so I wouldn't put specific timelines on it.
Yeah,
but
I'm not putting just the illustration.
But that's more or less my position, right? I do think that when Jesus speaks of degrees of punishment, it seems inconsistent to think of everybody having the same punishment.
Right, so that's one of my questions though, is that in all of these presentations, including, it's Mark, right? Mark's presentations last night and stuff, death is the punishment. So it doesn't seem to me like, I don't know how you're getting a biblical argument for some degree of punishment.
I think because death and destruction are definitely centered when it comes to this punishment for sin. The wages of sin is death, for example.
Yeah.
But I do think, like I said, I'd have to pull up the passages. I want to say, I'm probably pulling this completely out of nowhere, but I want to say Luke 12:47 through 48 is where you have a parable where Jesus speaks of degrees of punishment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can think of several of those sorts of things, right? But that's one of my questions in all of my things is like, okay, well, is death the punishment, or is the torture the punishment, or some other? Yeah,
I think death is the punishment, but I think there's different ways to die, I suppose you could say.
That's what you guys have said. I don't really find that argument that convincing at the moment. I think perhaps maybe you could add some more nuance that would make it more compelling. But
we find that intuitively, like in this life, because if somebody is executed, like in a firing squad instantly, or if they're, what's that thing they do where they put the person in a boat and let them like bake in the sun for like a week, something like that. Like we recognize one is a more severe punishment than the other, even though when all's said and done, the biggest thing is the death, which they have in common. But we still recognize there's a difference.
No, I don't dispute the difference.
I understand what you're saying.
But I'm disputing, to me, the biblical arguments that you're making are largely for death.
Yeah, because that is the main thing.
Right,
like in those situations of an execution.
It's also the primary biblical language.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely understand that, but
and maybe that's why guys like, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting Chris on this. Maybe that's why Chris's position is I'm not really concerned about degrees. I'm just going to talk about the death thing because that's the.
Yeah, I mean, he has brought up this degrees of death argument as well.
Okay.
So that's something that he's certainly open to.
Okay.
But I guess I'm just saying, like, in all of the passages that are referencing death and destruction, I don't see any talk about degrees in those passages, if that makes sense.
In those passages, yeah, I'd have to think about that.
If that makes a little bit of sense. I'm just saying, like, it's like, all right, yeah. Like, we take those ones or whatever, they seem more isolated, away from the other ones that talk about degrees.
There's another parable of Jesus where he talks about not getting out until you paid the last cent, right? Which sort of suggests that there could be differences in debts.
I think that's eschatological context.
Yeah,
I think that's like, I think he says settle matters quickly with your adversaries taking you to court.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you'll be thrown in whatever, debtor's prison.
Yeah.
Don't do that until you pay the last cent. I want to apply that to the afterlife.
Well, I think there's a judgment context. Now the question is that only referring to judgments on earth with human judges, or is there an eschatological? Is there a divine judge view there as well?
I believe that's in a Sermon on the Mount, isn't it?
That is. I want to say there's another passage where he says something similar, but the one you quoted, that version definitely is the Sermon.
Well, like the one I was thinking of, honestly, is Judas, right? Where he says, "Oh, it would be, better for him to have never been born than, to be the son of perdition," and all this stuff.
Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess I'm inclined, maybe you'd call my view sort of like a hybrid view, where I do think death is the key punishment, but I think there's an element of suffering as well.
Yeah.
It's just not eternal conscious torment.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we can call it TCE, temporary conscious torment. I don't know.
Yeah, it comes up with a lot of them. And you had a question too. I remember you brought up about like if death is destroyed in the lake of fire, does that mean that it's not really punishment for man? I started to think about that as you were talking about like getting to the degrees of punishment and everything. I would say with something like that, it would be kind of like a situation where you have a dying dog that's in pain, and you have a person on death row about to get the death penalty, and say they get killed lethal injection, right? Both of them suffer the exact same thing. Like when a dog's put to sleep, you're basically doing the exact same thing you're doing to the murderer. But we would note that in one case, One is a punishment. One is a punishment because it's a human who's not supposed to be killed, who's supposed to live his natural life, made in the image of God, and being killed is a punishment, capital punishment. Whereas the other, the dog's getting the exact same fate, but one, it's a dog, it's an animal, and two, it's being done out of mercy, it's not punishment. So I think one, the who is receiving the action is part of the equation, So an entity like death being destroyed isn't being punished because it's not something that can be punished. Whereas a human or the devil, like they're supposed to live forever, they're losing that life. To them, that is a punishment because of what they were supposed to have and the position they have.
But I'm going to flip this on you guys for half a second and stuff. Let's say that there's some sort of temporary torment, right? Almost everybody that I know of, if you're in the midst of being tormented, death is a mercy. It's not a punishment at that point, right? That's why we call it mercy killing.
Okay, so that's a good question. One thing I keep thinking about is kind of in sort of the modern West, I think we try to sort of sanitize things like the death penalty, right? But that's not always been the case. Like sometimes, someone might in the past, someone may be tried for a crime, the death penalty is given, and then it's how do we kill them? And then, and if you feel like they really deserve something horrible, maybe you give them something really horrible. And if you feel, that maybe that's not quite so bad, you do something that's more of a mercy, right? So I think ultimately the death penalty is still the thing. As far as killing being a mercy, I suppose in some way you could say that. I think part of why conditionalism is maybe more attractive than eternal conscious torment is that you have both judgment and mercy at the same time. Whereas the eternal conscious torment feels like it's just unending judgment, unrelenting, unsympathetic, unempathetic judgment forever and ever and ever. I feel like there is, we're talking about punishment, but we're talking about other things as well. I mean, we're talking about God restoring the world and making it good, for example. That's another aspect of what we're talking about.
Yeah. Now, since I'm here and stuff, we'll be the theologian for 2 seconds, right? And say that it seems that the whole point is that mercy and justice don't seem like they can necessarily coexist like at the same time in the same sense, right? That sound right? They're contradictory, and like if you say like, oh, I'm giving you justice and mercy simultaneously to the full degree. If you took them to both ends, right? You can say it's like I'm giving you some mercy and some justice. You could say it to different degrees in one way or another. But if you were to say it's like I'm giving you 100% mercy, now here's your punishment. It would say it's like that doesn't make sense.
Well, here's the thing though. It's only mercy to kill the person if what they deserved was eternal torment.
That's right.
Or so if they deserve eternal torment, then yes, to kill them is mercy. If annihilation is what's deserved, which not all annihilationists, but a lot would say is the case, like, we'd appeal to Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death, that's what's earned. If that's the case, then it's not mercy to kill them, it's just giving them what they deserve.
Sure. Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. Well, and that's why I was just objecting to like the idea of like, well, it's justice and mercy. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think he's right. I mean, maybe you should correct this. Conditionalism seems more merciful when you compare it to traditionalism, right?
Right. Well, and of course, it is. I think you have correctly said though, right? That's only if you did deserve more, right? And I think that's completely fair. Which is why, like hypothetically, if you took one of the atheist objections very seriously in the notion of, how can an infinite God punish finite beings or, in eternity, that sort of notion or whatever. If you said it's like, well, no, your punishment wouldn't be for eternity because your sins only equate to whatever, 100 million years or a million, whatever. It doesn't really matter, whatever you pick the number is, whatever the correct thing is. All of us can be quite confident that God will justly deal out whatever that punishment is. Right? None of us are too concerned about that.
Yeah. No, that's a fair point, a fair correction. Yeah, if annihilation is what you deserve, then it's not merciful to get what you deserve.
Yeah. God's justice, which is all the majority of traditionalists would be concerned about. Is just making sure it's like, okay, is this truly justice or not?
It's only merciful in comparison with the thought experiment that you might live forever, suffer in torment, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I will say there are annihilationists. I don't know if they're the majority. They probably aren't. And I don't hold this view, but there are some who would say, yeah, people, they do deserve eternal torment for their sin. So when God kills them, it is a mix of justice and mercy because they're not getting full mercy of like getting eternal life and being saved, but they're still they get less of a punishment than they actually deserve. So in that model, you could say there's both justice and mercy, not together, but in the sense that it's partial justice and partial mercy.
That's right, yeah. Now, and the objection to that is the idea that it's like, well, okay, so then God isn't, justice is actually never fulfilled fully.
Mm-hmm.
Because like, well, we could say that God's full love is displayed in different regards, like justice is only partially fulfilled, so that God is not, in some sense, it's like his justice is left incomplete.
Well, I mean, you kind of run into that problem with the fact that people are forgiven of their sins at all.
No, but you don't, because the cross is what fulfills that entirely. And that would be the idea that God fulfills justice on the cross.
Right.
But if sinners are suffering eternally in the lake of fire, then justice is never really complete because they're never quite done paying for their sin. There's never quite, it is finished type.
No, but that would actually be the exact idea. Now, just going out for a limb and stuff, the idea is like, no, justice is always active. So in this other view, God's justice is never seen again, ever. So God's attributes are actually never always, all of his attributes are no longer on display, but rather some of his attributes are completely missed and no longer.
Which goes back to that philosophical argument that the reason that God might want to torture people forever is to glorify himself and display his attributes, right?
Yeah. And I'm not saying that necessarily, but I understand what you're saying is like, well, but this is never gone away with. Is like, yeah, but on the other hand, his attributes are actually gone away with. Justice is never.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. I think it's going away with, but I see what you're saying.
Well, how was it on display for all of eternity before there was even creation? I mean, there was no one for God to punish in hell all of eternity past or at the beginning.
That brings us to the question of whether wrath is an attribute of God that needs expression, or whether it's just a response to sin.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that go into that. Yeah. And love and all of the different attributes can all be talked about in some of this.
Or we keep the action there forever, just as a reminder that it's in me.
Listen, I can do this all day, but I don't know what we're looking
Yeah,
at.
we're at
Yeah, what is the time?
2:06 now.
Oh, okay.
I gotta hit the next one.
I did remember, I did have a couple physical copies of that book that I mentioned that I'd written if anybody wants to take it, but it's also free on Kindle
Okay, wonderful.
right now if you guys want it.
All right. Well,
So thank you.
thank you. That was wonderful. Let's give him a hand.